scratch on my nose. I think you have all class to come up with something clever.
Whenever someone comes up and says, I remember the day you said, I always get a little nervous.
No, you wouldn't have to remember. It was like a super long time ago, but I just remember I came out and you were greeting after service that morning.
Good morning. Everybody can get their refreshments and their places. My name is Dave Toder. I'm with the St. John's Board of Discipleship and part of that, the Bible Study Planning Committee. And I'm here to introduce the new topic for the next 5 weeks and our presenter. So our topic for the next 5 weeks is A Tale of Two Synods. It's the split between the Missouri and Wisconsin synods occurred more than 60 years ago, yet that event has had an enduring impact on both church bodies. Retired Wisconsin Lutheran College professor Reverend Dr. Mark Brown will present the history surrounding the split as documented in his 2003 book, A Tale of Two Synods. The last session of the class will focus on events since 1961, as well as an optimistic outlook on the future of the synods. Now for our presenter, Mark Brown grew up in Milwaukee and attended Mount Lebanon Lutheran School. He graduated from Northwestern College in Watertown in 1974, completed a Master of Divinity degree from Wisconsin Lutheran Seminary in Mequon in 1978, completed a Master of Sacred Theology degree also from Wisconsin Lutheran Seminary in 1992, and earned a PhD in Historical Theology from Concordia Seminary, St. Louis in 2000. Dr. Brown served as a vicar in Anchorage, Alaska, summer 1975, and again during the 1976-77 school year. He was assigned in 1978 to be an assistant pastor at Grace Lutheran Church, St. Joseph, Michigan. In 1983, he accepted the call to be pastor of St. John Lutheran Church in Sparta, Wisconsin. In 1987, Wisconsin Lutheran College called him to be the director of spiritual life programming and an instructor of theology. He retired in 2021. Dr. Brown is the author of the People's Bible volume on Deuteronomy, A Tale of Two Synods, events that led to the split between Wisconsin and Missouri, and Time Between the Testaments, all published by Northwestern Publishing House. He is the author of the Concordia Commentary volume on Judges, to be published by Concordia Publishing House. He is married to Sue, a veteran Lutheran elementary school teacher. They are blessed with 4 adult children and 9 grandchildren. Mark and Sue live in Heartland and are members of Christ Lutheran Church in Pewaukee. Dr. Brown.
Thank you. Wow, that's really long, isn't it? Just means that I'm really old, I think. Well, thank you for coming. This is an old topic. You have to be 62 years old to have even been alive when the actual split occurred. I mean, the final action, 1961. And you'd probably have to be in your late 70s to even have been, let's say, a teenager and known something about this. So the time really, when I worked on this 20 years ago, a little bit more than 20 years ago, it was kind of an optimal time to get people who'd gone through this to talk about it, because in a lot of cases the pastors were old enough to be retired but young enough to tell me what they thought. And I'm finding that now too. We tend to feel we have less to lose if we tell people what we really think about stuff. Now, but this has become a somewhat timely topic now for a couple of reasons. One of them is, and I'm going to talk about this the last week, one of them is that for more than a decade, there have been conversations between Wisconsin, Missouri, and Evangelical Lutheran Synod leaders and pastors outside of fellowship. Nobody's having communion together or praying together, but they're talking with each other. And in many ways, there's a better relationship between them than has probably existed in almost a century. In fact, I saw President Schrader from our synod and President Matt Harrison from the Missouri Synod. Matt Harrison looks like a Civil War reenactor, big, burly, handlebar mustache. And I said to someone next to me, I don't think anybody's seen that for such a long time. The other is that we're going to work our way toward an event in the Missouri Synod, which came a little bit later when we were no longer in fellowship with them, but it is sometimes called the walkout. We call it the walkout because we take the view that most of the faculty and student body went on strike. They call it the exile, meaning they were forced out. The 50th anniversary of that happening is next year. And Missouri historians have already been writing about this and trying to understand it more. And so it brings back, I mean, that was a memory when I was in college that had happened. We're all watching what's going on there. They want to talk about that and try to understand it. And they're inviting some Wisconsin Synod and other groups in to talk about how they saw it from the outside. So I'm going to have the chance to go to Concordia in Fort Wayne to their seminary and talk about how we saw this when we were no longer a part of it. So it does have some relevance, even though this is kind of old news. The publishing house did me a great service by putting this one-page ad in the old Northwestern Lutheran. What do you know about the split? And of course, with each year that goes by, there are people who know a little bit less. And so this book promised that it was going to inform people about it. This was really my dissertation at Concordia St. Louis. So I was writing a dissertation for the seminary of the other church body. And by that time, many things had changed again in St. Louis, where Concordia was closer to where we are again. But they had memories of that. And apparently this was some interest at that time to do this topic, because ordinarily, you know, when you do a dissertation, you have an advisor and two readers, and you have to defend to them. And you have to defend the proposal before you do that. So I went to St. Louis, and I was told that my advisor had put a note on the faculty bulletin board saying that I was going to be there to talk about that, and about 25 guys there. And they all wanted to ask different questions. Some of them I thought fairly unfair. And so the director said, first thing we're going to do here, Mark, is going to sit you down, and all kinds of belts and straps will fold you in, and then we'll force you to pray with us. So you can kind of tell what the mood was right off from the start. This is what the book actually looks like, and I had nothing to do with the cover. And the cover was suggested, is simply a stock photo from some collection, chosen by Paul Burmeister, who is now an art professor at WLC, but he was then at NPH. But you know, I hope he read it before he did this, because whether he read it or not, he really managed to capture part of this, is that this was an inter-family rivalry and connection. And you may have been living right next door to somebody who was in the other synod. And maybe your neighbor would be saying, you know, you're wrong and we're right, or maybe they would be saying, I don't know whether I should stay here or not. And that was especially true in Milwaukee in this area, because Milwaukee is, I think, just about the only big city in the United States that has a significant Missouri and a significant Wisconsin Synod population. We have one church in St. Louis, so there isn't a lot of debate there. So it captured the idea of it. Now, the book starts out with a little bit of an introduction, which acquaints people with where we're going to go, and then a chapter called Sister Synods, which looks back on the time in which the two synods were so closely united that many people thought it was just one large church body. However, there were also, we often call them sister synods, and as you probably know from experience, she can be your sister, but there are times when you can fight, and only you can fight that way. So there were disagreements and differences of culture and personality, even when we were together. But I talked to many people who said this was a wonderful time. They went to school together, they preached at each other's churches, they intermarried. They never thought this would end. We're going to do that today, quickly. Then the next topic is called The Gathering Storm, and I borrowed this line from Churchill, because he talked about that with a growing sense of Europe coming to war in World War II, and one of my readers said, well, that's kind of overblowing it, isn't it? Well, I don't know. Maybe a better line would be a line from a song from the 60s. There's something happening here. What it is isn't exactly clear. That there were people on our side that were saying something's changing about this relationship, but we can't put our finger on it. And of course, in Missouri, they said, no, 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 nothing's changing. But bit by bit it was. And that will especially next week focus on the questions of scouting, and could you be in the scout movement, which I'm afraid most people can't begin to even imagine how that was an issue. Well, maybe they could. And about our involvement in the military chaplaincy, which was a big issue during World War II. What became clear, as we talked about it some more, was that the issue, those were just presenting issues, the issue was church fellowship. And that's probably the hardest topic to talk about in a way, because maybe everyone has an unhappy fellowship story in one way or the other, where they were disinvited from going to communion, or they were told, in error by the way, that you can't even pray with your grandma, or things like that. And so that is the big chapter, or actually really two chapters. It became clear that fellowship was really the issue that was dividing us. And then that chapter is more focused on some changes that happened in Missouri. And then the next chapter was how Wisconsin responded, which took about 20 some years from beginning to end to sort this through. And then there was also a question going on kind of simultaneously about what exactly was being taught and believed at Concordia Seminary in St. Louis, the primary Missouri Synod seminary, and what was being believed and taught by some younger pastors. So that was really an issue more about how they regarded the Scripture. Was it the Word of God? Was it simply history, which could be mistaken? And we had a hard time, I had a difficult time figuring out what exactly did one have to do with the other. Now, we'll see when we get to that fourth chapter that led to this problem at St. Louis, which meant that the faculty went on strike, and there was a tumultuous experience that Missouri Synod had because of that. And then there's a little following up at the end. Where have we gone since then? Now, because Missouri is reviewing their history from 50 years ago, and to some extent because we're celebrating 175th anniversary in 2025, the publishing house has asked me to write volume 2 of this book, which will be called After the Split. What has happened since then? And I would like to talk about that a little bit on the 5th lesson. And this will be more, what should I say, a work in progress. And I'm getting some ideas. But how do we get to where we are today? And because a lot of things have happened since then. So this was the article that was in the Milwaukee Journal the day after the decision by the delegates at Wisconsin Lutheran College. Oops, oh, went too fast. They met, it was at the gym in Wisconsin Lutheran High School. And as it says in this clip here, it says that the action was hailed as the hour of decision. It was approved that delegates would break with the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod. The meeting went 8 hours over schedule, and the president of the synod had to carefully monitor the time and use his gavel so nobody could take too much of the time. There were people still lined up to speak when they finally called it, and they called the vote. And you notice here that the vote was 124 to 49. After all these years of preparation, this was still a contested vote. And there were still people who said to me, you know, if we would have had a little bit more time allotted to our being able to talk about this, that wouldn't have happened. At any rate, it says the Reverend Werner Franzmann, chairman of the floor committee for the Wisconsin Synod, there was always a floor committee that would study this question and then make a recommendation to the voters. And he said, we have gone the long mile of Christian love with the Missouri Synod with a course and kind of admonition we have given until now. Today, a sterner kind of love and admonition is required. You maybe know that there's a big Franzmann family in our side of Lutheranism. And Werner Franzmann was a pastor. He was a longtime editor at the publishing house. His brother Martin had been a pastor and professor in the Wisconsin Synod, took a call to St. Louis back in the 1940s when that didn't matter so much. So they found themselves on two opposite sides of this question. And So what Missouri often did was they would send Martin Franzman as the observer, the Missouri Synod observer to our conventions, and he would stand and say, please be patient with us. We're a big church body. We're trying to get our own house in order. Please don't make an action yet. So what they did in 1961, our synod has asked his brother to be the chairman of the floor committee for the same issue. And I had more old pastors, probably all of them have gone to heaven just about by now, who said, I watched one brother at one microphone say, please be patient, and the other brother saying, the patience has run out. It just, that was just so vivid for them, like it had happened yesterday. Then there's a third brother, Jerry, who was a professor in Watertown. I had him as a professor in college. And when I put out a survey about this, he wrote back and he says, that was the hardest thing I ever got to watch, because they're both my brothers, and I love them both. So there are a lot of elements in this story that were difficult. Here's the convention floor at Wisconsin Lutheran High School. I remember bumping into I was in probably 4th grade then, bumping into my kindergarten teacher at church, and she said, I'm going to take all my children to sit in the gallery because this is something historic that's going to happen. So that was in the newspaper. As a 9-year-old, I was much more interested in how the Braves were doing. And the week before, Warren Spahn had won his 300th game. The Braves beat the Cubs 2-1. I was all over it, studied all the sports pages, looked at all the box scores. So 40 years later, when I was going through the papers looking for articles about the split, there was all the sports page stuff that I still had blazoned in my memory. Now, the first chapter, this is partly because it's required when you do a dissertation of any kind. You have to do the review of the literature, or you have to put the reader in context. And this turned out to be pretty helpful to have done, because other people besides people in our church body have read this history, so they didn't really know much about this. And the story of Lutheranism in America is, of course, a story of immigrants coming from various parts of the world. And our synod's history began at a time when Milwaukee was the western frontier. In fact, one of the ways they would measure that is they look at the population and check the number of females compared to a number of males compared to every 100 females in the population. The higher the number of men, the more rowdy we were. See, women are, in many good ways, a civilizing influence. And the number was like 117 males for every 100 females. So coming to Milwaukee, and Wisconsin had just become a state. So this was the end of the frontier, so to speak. But Milwaukee and Wisconsin were becoming a very German area. Originally, Yankees had settled some of these areas from the east. But besides that, there were Irish immigrants who were, and in many cases still are, Roman Catholic. There were Polish immigrants who also were predominantly Roman Catholic. They still have their polka mass every year at the ethnic festival. Lots. There were Italians. Here's a picture of one of the processions of the Virgin Mary statue in front of. I don't know if that's I can't remember. I don't think that's St. Mary's downtown, but one of them. And of course, there were many Germans. Not only Germans who were Lutheran, but also Germans who were Catholic, and some who were free thinkers. If you ever took a course on 19th century European history, you may have heard the term the 48ers. In 1848, it happened to be a time when there were independent thinkers, and they were going to challenge traditional ways of looking at things, and that's how they referred to themselves. We were the 1848ers, which was the same year Wisconsin became a state. And so it was kind of a wide open religious market even for Lutherans. And they would gather in a lot of organizations as well as churches. They had a strong interest in elementary school, both private church school and other kinds of education. They were in lots of farms. There were many farming communities, especially in the eastern half, southeastern part of Wisconsin, and then there's another whole batch in south central Minnesota, which became central to the Minnesota district and later on. And I'm always amazed to look at pictures from these old country churches, because you go to them today and there are so many that are just hanging on to survive. And the numbers are very small today, and their children and grandchildren have gone to school and moved off away. But you look back at old pictures of these churches, there were big families. Those farmers had lots of kids, because the more kids you had, the more land you could take care of. And these were really vibrant places. And so all these places were asking, some of them should have been asking sooner, but they were asking for Lutheran pastors. We have children who need to be baptized. We're kind of living together. We should get married. And so the immigrant pastors would come, and they had all they could do to keep up with that. It was also an urban, there's a strong urban sense in Milwaukee. This is Wisconsin Avenue. In 1887, standing about where, it was called Grand Avenue then, but standing about on 4th Street, and you're looking down to the east, and you see that there's a building in your way, because the three people who began Milwaukee could never stand each other, and so they made sure that in every way possible they made the roads crooked between one and the other. And so that's why you have to swing south a little bit when you go across Wisconsin Avenue. There's an extra street stuck in there. And people talk about the huge numbers of German Lutheran or sort of Lutheran people who came. Some of our church records at places like St. John's on 8th and Vliet and the Missouri Synod Church, Trinity downtown, their record books would show 300 and 400 baptisms a year of children. That's 8 to 10 a week. At St. Marcus, Pastor Jeske's great-grandfather was August Pieper, and he would say on Sunday mornings, he would say after church, all of you who just got off the boat this week and want to join, you line up over there. So they didn't have to work very hard to find people to bring in. What they had to work at was making them Lutheran, because they may not have been in catechism class ever, may have left Germany to get away from all those traditional things. Not everybody who came over here was concerned about religion or coming for religious freedom. My great-great-grandfather came as a draft dodger. He didn't want to go into Bismarck's army. So I guess if I had gone to Canada in the 1970s, I've been following a family tradition, but I got a high draft number so I wasn't called on. And many of us who were in Lutheran elementary schools at a certain time remember this book cover, because this was one of the versions of a book called You and Your Synod, which was intended to educate largely grade school children about what their synod was about, some of the history, the synodical schools, the mission work they were done. So here's the cover, and it shows that by and large the Germans came from northern Germany, probably out of that big Dock B where the Beatles went and had such a introduction to the nasty life, Hamburg maybe. And they came across, and then they came down and came to the port in New York, and then from there some of them went up the Hudson River and went over to Buffalo. So there was an old synod called the Buffalo Synod, and others came through the Great Lakes. Some came into Michigan, in the Thumb area of Michigan, a huge area of still Missouri Synod Lutherans. Some came into Milwaukee or into Chicago. There were other groups that went across to Minnesota, and then up the river from New Orleans up as far as St. Louis was a larger group that became the beginnings of the Missouri Synod. So this was a huge wave of people that were coming then. In Wisconsin at that time, there were only several cities that were really very large, and most of them were either forts or ports where things could be, hides could be shipped out or things like that. Prairie du Chien and La Crosse were rather old. Milwaukee wasn't major. Green Bay was more major. And so they were coming into an area that was wide open and had great opportunity. And generally the pastors would follow, trying to gather the people who had been lost. Now, one of the key differences between the early Missouri and Wisconsin Synod was the difference in ability and leadership qualities of the two major founders. This is C.F.W. Walther, Karl Ferdinand Wilhelm Walther. This is the best picture I can find of him. People were not coming to church because he'd look good on TV, you know. But Walther he left a tremendous imprint on the Missouri Synod over a career that lasted more than 40 years in the United States. He was a regular preacher. He was a pastor of one of the growing churches downtown in an area close to the river called Soulard. He had a great deal of self-confidence because he started a quarterly journal about how Lutherans ought to teach and live before there even was a Missouri Synod, and he felt no qualms whatever about telling other Lutherans how they ought to live and believe. And of course, those of us who saw Walther on our side, we just love him and admire him. But when you occasionally read people who were on the other side, they had a few things they didn't like about Walther. But he brought a great amount of concern about Lutheran confessional doctrine, but he was also aggressive at reaching out to others. He started Concordia Seminary in 1839. He was one of the founders of the Missouri Synod in 1847, and he is highly revered to this day. Whatever doctrinal debate you want to get into in the Missouri Synod, you want to try to demonstrate that you believe what Walther believed. So even to listen to anybody when I was in grad school say, I'm not sure Walther was right about this, was just shocking. So after Walther died, he was replaced as the head teacher and leader of the Missouri Synod by a man named Franz Pieper. Now, Franz Pieper and his brother August both came from Germany and both came to Watertown, and they were really sons of the Wisconsin Synod. But there was a short period of time where we closed our seminary to try to have one seminary, and both of them had gone to have Walther in Missouri. And so they were very imprinted by Walther also, although they had some things they would disagree about, not doctrinally, but just more practice. But here was what Franz Pieper says: we believe that it is not saying too much, and we declare that after Luther and another Martin named Martin Chemnitz, he said, no other teacher has attested the doctrine of justification so impressively as did Walther. It was particularly in this doctrine that he followed Luther, and he united into one shining beam of light all other bright rays. You find writing like this about Walther all the time in Missouri writing. The 200th anniversary of his birth was in 2011, and there were observations and all kinds of events and studies about him, including in the Wisconsin Synod, because he had an impact on us. And by contrast, most people in the Wisconsin Synod don't even know who was one of our founders. And of course, Missouri really doesn't. This is the man. This is a bad picture of him. I'll have a better one. His name was John Mühlhäuser, and he founded Grace Church in downtown Milwaukee on Broadway and Juneau. But when he first came, he didn't even want to have it be a Lutheran church. He wanted it to be called Trinity, and he wanted it to be more open. I told you that after 1848, there were some freethinkers and rationalists who were Germans who came over. And Mühlhäuser says, I don't have anything in connection with them because they don't preach Christ. But Mühlhäuser said, I am willing to extend the hand of fellowship to anybody who's a genuine believer. And he was originally going to come here and ride the trains in Wisconsin and hand out tracts, because he was not ordained as a clergyman. He got what we would call a lay education in evangelism. He was really a baker's apprentice. But he had such a heart for sharing the message of Jesus, he went to a mission institute in Germany and then applied to go to Africa. And they thought he was too old and not probably instructed well enough to do this. He came to Milwaukee and he was going to ride the trains, and he decided he was too old for that. So he started a church. Not that there weren't enough of them, but he wanted to start one of his own. And he and 4 other non-connected Lutheran pastors started the German Evangelical Lutheran Church of Wisconsin in 1850 at Salem Church on 107th and Fond du Lac. Not in this building, although this building is very old. It goes back to the Civil War. Excuse me, I got a little bit of a tickle. But it was not uncommon in Wisconsin churches to share their building or even their pastor with another church that was Protestant but not Lutheran. And Mühlhäuser was open to that. In fact, he would get requests. You can still read the correspondence that came to him. He said, church would write and say, we are looking for a pastor who can do Lutheran, but who can also do what they call Reformed. And of course, there would be differences over things like, what did the Lord's Supper mean? Do you baptize babies? They all complained about the Methodists because they complained that the Methodists were way too aggressive. They said, these Methodist preachers will come and stand outside your church building and try to pull people out of our churches into their church. One of them says, I met a Methodist pastor who promised people that if you go to church at his church, you aren't going to ever get a cold or the flu. So they were almost like the faith healers that we sometimes hear today. So you can see that a church body that is going to develop, or pastors that are going to be in fellowship with each other, that are going to be connected with Mühlhäuser, are going to have a different outlook on how they taught Lutheran teaching than those who are coming from the Missouri Synod and others like the Buffalo Synod and so on. For a few years, we didn't know that each other were there. I mean, there were churches, Milwaukee was so wide open. But starting about 1855, when the more confessional Missouri pastors found that there were these kind of softer, milder Lutherans that were also in town, Mühlhäuser and Wisconsin pastors became their target. And this is probably just about the only letter of Mühlhäuser's that we have that he wrote to somebody else. We have letters that were written to him. I think there are maybe 3 or 4 sermons in that collection, not too many. And Walther's books and papers and sermons cover volumes. But he said, just because I am not strictly Lutheran or old Lutheran, which is what they called being a confessional person, I am in a position to offer every child of God and servant of Christ the hand of fellowship over the church fence. Have quite often been together with English preachers of the various denominations in ministerial conference, and we respected and loved each other as brethren and deliberated on the general welfare of the church. So I am not, my dear Methodist brother, withdrawing the hand of brotherhood from you if you are a Methodist in the spirit of the Methodist Church's founder. He was actually writing to one of the pastors that had come over from Germany and was coming over as a Lutheran, but he decided to become a Methodist. So on the one hand, Mühlhäuser said, I'm not going to stop being in fellowship with you because you made that decision, because I look at you as a brother in Christ. Not as typically is the next paragraph quoted, where he says, as a non-theologian, I am wondering how you, a theologian pledged to the confessional books, could take the step to Methodism without a struggle. You won't expect me to believe that the teaching of the Methodist Church, especially regarding the sacraments, yes, even pertaining to justification and sanctification, is Lutheran. I think most charitably, we should look at Mühlhäuser as someone who, in his heart, believed what Lutheranism teaches about the sacraments and about Christ dying for our sins. But he was not as insistent upon agreement on all areas in order to have church together. He, when he dedicated the building that was downtown before Grace was built, the current Grace building, he invited 6 pastors from other denominations to assist in the cornerstone laying and the dedication later on. He called the Lutheran confessions paper fences. And what he meant by that was they're people that they're documents that unnecessarily keep people apart. Now this was fighting words to Walther and his kind, and there was about a stretch of about 13 years of accusations and counter-accusations back and forth. When you read correspondence from that time, you get a sense that this was kind of the Wild West for churches in general. There were a lot of pastors who didn't have very good training, didn't know how to behave themselves this way. A lot of them were entrepreneurs, and they were trying to keep their church open. There wasn't much support from any kind of a parent body, so they were looking for money and they were looking for bodies, and they were fairly nasty with each other. I would say that we can still be nasty today, but we are more subtle in our language sometimes, but it still goes on. But they were all trying to sort out, well, exactly where do we stand on these issues and what really do we believe? People who know about Mühlhäuser say he was a wonderfully kind-hearted man. He was standing at the dock when, boatloads of Germans would get off the boat. If they needed some food, if they needed a piece of furniture for someplace they're going to live, he was very kind. But we don't talk about him a lot. Whereas in the Missouri Synod, you can buy little statues of Walther, and there are churches named the Walther Lutheran Church, and every teenager for about 30 years in the 20s, 30s, and 40s belonged to the Walther League. They don't know who the founder here is. Now, what was happening, though, was that during those 15 years, more of the pastors coming over from Germany had gotten a better Lutheran education. And so while they made contacts with Mühlhäuser, they were not so much of the spirit that he was. And Mühlhäuser saw this coming. In fact, people who knew him at the end of his life said, he would be in the cell, like when the pastors had a get-together, he would be there until the discussion got too pointed about doctrine, and then he would go out on the sidewalk and have a cigar, because he didn't want to listen to that. And it's significant that it was only several months after Mühlhäuser died that a group of Wisconsin pastors made overtures to Missouri saying, "We have been changing, and we would like to talk with you." Here is the general take on how Wisconsin churches feel about how the old Lutherans treated them. As it was, the almost contemptuous treatment Wisconsin pastors received at the hands of the old Lutherans, the haughty condescension with which they were occasionally met, caused hurt and confusion and kept them away from the synods already at work in Wisconsin. These early Wisconsin men certainly did not lay claim to being perfect. They were no angels, but neither were the old Lutherans. This was something written by Pauline and his grandfather in 1950 when we were 100 years old. That has been the general sense, that the old Lutherans, like in Missouri Synod, they were clear on their Lutheran doctrine, but they were nasty about it. And we could have used their help a little bit more. That is a little bit more black and white history than has really happened. Because now that there are more letters and correspondence being published of what they wrote to each other, there was some nastiness on every side. And it was just a time, somewhat like Luther's time, I think, was a time where people just spoke to each other in harsher ways. What happened then, shortly after, it was happening already, what happened with greater interest after Mühlhäuser died, was a turn to the right, meaning that Wisconsin became more like Missouri in how it saw the confessions and other doctrines. And what Missouri would like to say is, well, we helped you out. We kind of straightened you out. In fact, when I was working on this, I went to see my uncle who lived west of Appleton. In fact, just a couple weeks before he died. And I was in the area and visited him, and I said, "Is that what you heard?" And he says, "Well, that's what we were told. We didn't have it right, and they straightened us out." And his own father-in-law was a Missouri Synod pastor, so maybe he told him that too. But it was actually more of an internal sense to become more confessional. This is Adolf Heinecke. He was the first of the pastors who came from Wisconsin who had a thorough theological training. And he became our first really well-rounded doctrinal teacher. And he was at the seminary, when we had a seminary in Milwaukee, just a few people, and then when it was a bigger seminary in Wauwatosa, just across the street from where St. James is now. And then his partner was Johannes Bading, who was the pastor downtown at St. John's and 8th and Valete for 40 years. He was there for 40 years, and after him, John Brenner came for 50. So they had two pastors for 90 years. And Bading was the practical person, Heinecke was the teacher, and they helped direct these young and somewhat inexperienced pastors in the direction of how to teach. Heinecke began the Gemeindeblatt, which is the German counterpart to the Northwestern Lutheran, the magazine for lay people to read in their homes. And there was something called the Northwestern Conference, excuse me. The pastors who came to places like Slinger, Schlesingerville they called it then, and West Bend and other areas kind of in an arc northwest of Milwaukee were more devoted to having a confessional Lutheran position than some of the guys downtown. And so later on, in honor of the good influence that those Northwestern pastors had, they named various things Northwestern, like Northwestern Prep School, Northwestern Conference, the Northwestern Lutheran, Northwestern Publishing House. I'm ashamed to admit how old I was before I knew that that's why they called it that. I thought it had something to do with the Northwest Ordinance that divided up all this land after the Revolutionary War. It had nothing to do with that. So what happened was that there was a change internally. And this is my church history teacher was Edward Frederick, and he really always made this point. It wasn't Missouri criticizing us in the public press. It was more two things. One was the better education, which the next generation of pastors had gotten in Germany. And the other was it was the good Missouri neighbor. And there were stories about a young Wisconsin pastor concerned about what his synod was like, and he'd see the Missouri pastor down the road, and he'd go and say, I think I got to leave. I think I want to come to your synod. And the Missouri pastor would inevitably say, you stay where you are. You make your influence felt there. So that Wisconsin was coming this way. And as my professor would say, it was not the polemical, the harsh writing of Missouri periodicals given to exaggeration of misinformation. It was more the good Missouri neighbor that helped move Wisconsin to the right. That and other factors brought about a change in Wisconsin long before Missouri ever noticed the existence of the Wisconsin Synod or directing their loving criticisms their way. So Mühlhäuser has died. The group that's becoming more confessional Wisconsin offers itself to Missouri and says, please come and talk with us. We think we have more in common. Walther kind of laughed at it at first, but then he examined more, and they had meetings in Milwaukee in 1868, and Walther said, somewhat famously, all our reservations about you no longer apply. And that set in motion a series of meetings over 4 years to establish what was called the Lutheran Synodical Conference, Evangelical Lutheran Synodical Conference of North America. And when we talk about church bodies being together, that's what we mean. And with the split was, first of all, the split of those churches. Now, this was what the Synodical Conference was by the end of it. It had a large contingency of the Missouri Synod, which was probably 6 times bigger than the Wisconsin Synod. And the Wisconsin Synod was at least 6 times bigger than the old little Norwegians, as they called them, the ELS. And then there's the Slovak Synod, which was really small. But at the beginning, there was the Missouri Synod, the Illinois Synod, which became a district of Missouri, the Wisconsin Synod, just the state of Wisconsin, the Minnesota Synod, all the Norwegians, centered some in Wisconsin, but mostly in southern Minnesota, and the Ohio Synod. The Ohio Synod left a decade later over a disagreement about the teaching of election or predestination, and it was a very big blow to the early Synodical Conference. So, so this is how it developed, and then this has a little picture off the side about how someone in the group left to form the Church Lutheran Confession, which happens way later in the late 1950s. Now, we were not all part of the same church body, but we were churches that were in fellowship with each other. And I would say somewhat typical with Missouri's personality. As soon as we were in fellowship, in fact, the declaration was at St. John's Church, not that building, but a previous one, which I think is paved over by the basketball arena. In 1872, they formally declared this harmony. And Walther kind of quickly said, let's make it all one big church body. And why don't we keep our seminary in St. Louis? You close your seminary. We'll close a college someplace, and we'll keep Northwestern. And Wisconsin, never liked that. And this is part of Wisconsin personality, where they love Missouri, but they said, but we don't want to be swallowed up by you either. And that was the complaint as the early 1870s went along. And Walther was saying, come on, being one big church. And Wisconsin says, we don't want to do that. And they even made comments that you're asking us to die a quiet death for Missouri, our group. And then a pastor of Missouri, I think he was maybe even a president of the Synodical Conference, he said in open meeting, you don't really love us. And Adolf Heinecke stood up and said, just because two people love each other doesn't mean they're always going to get married. And that ended the conversation. And so from that time on, Wisconsin and Missouri were always separate in fellowship, but separate synods. There were two other efforts in the one in early 1900s, the other 1930s, to try and bring them all together in one body, and the culture never went for that. In fact, John Brenner, who became president of the synod, he wrote once that organizations are not better or more equipped just because they're bigger. Sometimes they do better when they're smaller, which really showed that idea we don't ever really want to be swallowed up by Missouri. Now, what this meant a century later is that when Missouri went through its turmoil, we depended on them a lot, but to some extent we dodged a bullet when they went through their troubles. I should go back to this. So some of the chapter is about how we grew and in what directions. Wisconsin, there was the Michigan Synod, the Wisconsin Synod, the Minnesota Synod, and then there were additional groups in Dakota, Montana, in Nebraska and Iowa, Pacific Northwest and California. This was all amalgamated into what they used to call the Joint Synod of Wisconsin and other states, which meant that then there were 8 districts. There were 3 districts in Wisconsin, which there still are, northern, southeastern, and western, Minnesota district, Michigan district, and so on. So what that means, but Michigan, Wisconsin, and Minnesota each had their own small seminary, college and seminary, to train people to become pastors and to teach in schools. So Minnesota said, we will take our college, Dr. Martin Luther College, and focus on preparing teachers. And they also had a high school, Dr. Martin Luther High School, which was for students who could then either stay there for college or come to Watertown. The college in Watertown stayed as the pre-ministerial college. It had a prep school called Northwestern Prep. I'm a proud alumnus of Northwestern Prep, which doesn't exactly exist anymore. And then the school that was just starting in Michigan, in Saginaw, kept the name seminary, but it's really a high school. And I found that to be no end of confusion to almost everybody who learns about the synod. And there were several reasons that made Michigan kind of unhappy. They joined the synodical conference and they very quickly left. They didn't come back till about 1910. But then the synod typically went west. We didn't do a lot of activity in, let's say, Florida, Texas, and so on until about late, middle, early 20th century, 30s and 40s. And then especially as in the 50s and 60s, congregations in Missouri asked us to come and start a church there. And then we became more of a national church body. 16 states in 1961. The goal was every state by 78, and I think we just about made it. And didn't hold on to it for real long, did we? Because Lutheranism was pretty unknown some of those places. There's Trinity Church down on 9th and Highland. There's Grace, or that's St. John's on 8th and Vliet. Grace downtown, their new building built in 1901. St. Marcus actually started as a satellite elementary school and then became a church later. And as I said, the growth was tremendous. Not quite so much in the 1850s and 60s, but in Germany, with the ascension of Bismarck and Wilhelm III, I guess, German life became better, and the immigrants came with more money and a better life, and they came in droves. By 1900, German Americans were the largest group of not foreign-born American citizens in the country. This is where the schools were, again from that book in the 1960s. This looks somewhat different. I don't know why they gave this star number 1, but number 1 was a small preparatory high school in Mobridge, South Dakota. There are still some people I know who went to Mobridge. That school was always very small, I think 30 or 40, 50 students maybe. And it closed in the late 70s. And then star number 3 is Dr. Martin Luther College in New Ulm, now amalgamated with the old Northwestern and became simply Martin Luther College. There's number 5 is, I guess that's meant to be, I'm not sure what they're doing there. But there was the Northwestern College, Northwestern Prep in Watertown, the seminary in Mequon, and then the high school called a seminary in Saginaw. We've always been rightly proud of the fact that a church body our size, which has not always been a notable church for being generous in how they support mission work or synod work, has maintained this school system. And together with some of the Concordias in the Missouri Synod, you could get a deeper, more thorough education in Latin and German, in the biblical languages, than just about any other kind of church body in the country. There was a man named Bruce Metzger who was a world-renowned student of the Bible and studying the original languages and versions. He was invited to go to Mequon one time years ago during the summer. I don't think you were there then, but you may have heard about this. That might have been in between when you were a student and professor. And he got to see what was going on in some of the classrooms where everybody was learning the languages. Not necessarily always well. You know, not everybody who's going to be going through there is a candidate to be a professor in those languages. But all of them could understand a conversation intelligently about the language. And Bruce Metzger says, I didn't know any schools like this existed anymore. So, by and large, Wisconsin pastors will be greatly disturbed at any possibility that this system would be reduced or closed, or even that the languages would be not done as much. Now, we don't do nearly as much German and Latin as we used to do. My life would have been easier if we hadn't had so much Latin. And some can take the choice of Latin or Spanish, but the Hebrew and the Greek, absolutely. Here's the old Northwestern University in Watertown, which is now Luther Prep School. Yeah?
What happened with the Nebraska Synod?
I don't know that it came a little bit later, and I don't know that they ever had a school of their own. I think they would send what people they had to Mobridge, and then those synods amalgamated in 1919, so then, you know, the other smaller seminaries kind of readjusted in order to have a single system. And then Waco, as a Lutheran high school, didn't come along till much, much later.
It just had its 50th anniversary 5 years ago.
The district.
The school.
The which anniversary?
The Waco school.
How many years?
55, about 5 years ago.
50? Well, see, I'm getting older than I thought. Yeah, I guess that would, when I think about that, I'd be right that that's about when it was starting. Now, this is the school in Watertown. It was actually called Northwestern University for quite a few years until some of its leaders said, well, there's that school in Evanston, Illinois that is also called Northwestern. And this really isn't a university because everybody takes the same curriculum for the same goal. Let's call it Northwestern College. I don't know if there's a pointer. That building on the left was still there when I went to school there in the 1960s. That was what we called the old dorm. Affectionately, we called it the Pits. Built in 1875, and it had no plumbing in it. And then they put a 1905 wing on it so that you could go down the hall to get plumbing. Now that sounds pretty, what should I say, rustic. My grandfather, who was a good farmer, didn't have electricity or running water in his house until 1940. So my mother and people at that time, they went out to the cold path to the outhouse. And so to tell boys in 1905 that when you come here you're going to have indoor plumbing was a point in their favor. Just like today we try to entice students with all the fantastic equipment. We might think that get kind of irritated with that and say, well, you have to buy them to come so that they can have world-class facilities. That's only changed a little bit, not very much. And there are great pictures about the fun they had. This must have been Arbor Day because you had a whole group of people out with their shovels ready to dig up the campus. They still had Arbor Day when I was there, but the notable thing about that then was that everybody got off classes, you all went out and weeded a little bit in the bushes, and you were introduced to smoking. There was a little smoke shop downtown called Piccadilly, and we all had to make our trip down there the day before and buy the little cigars or cigarettes, and the upperclassmen made us prove that we were really smoking, which probably started some of us on a very bad habit. This is a picture of only a part of the student body at Watertown in 1925. Most of them were grade school children and early high school. Some kids went there at age 12 and then took off for a weekend to go home and be confirmed. They were that young. But it was all understood that all of this was Northwestern College. My high school diploma says that I graduated from the preparatory department of Northwestern College. So some of us, like I, spent 8 years on the same campus. In fact, I quit for a year, so I was inclusive, it was 9 years. And there just isn't a lot of enthusiasm, honestly, to go to the very same campus where you were a 14-year-old, and now you're going to be a college person, but not a lot has changed. Here's some of the guys in the dorm. Everybody looked happier then, it seems like. They're going to sing, I think that piano was still in the basement when I was there, and probably had not been tuned. When we talk about the Wauwatosa Seminary, this was the building, which was across the street from where St. James is now. And that was our seminary until the late 1920s, when the seminary moved out to what was then an open farm field in Thiensville, and now it's surrounded by gigantic, beautiful houses. We talk sometimes about the Wauwatosa teachers, especially John Kaler, and on the left, John Meyer, August Pieper. I'm not sure who the next guy is. I think he's a Meyer. He didn't last long. And they were the ones who really started the Theological Journal, which we still get every quarter, called Wisconsin Lutheran Quarterly. It's the oldest continuously published journal of theology in Lutheranism in the world, because many of them have gone through splits and rearrangements and stuff like that. And they really set the tone for the Synod's teaching and practice. Now, if you go to seminary today, you walk around and all the hallways have class pictures of all the classes. And you start out on the main floor. And then as you get a little bit older, they move you upstairs to the second floor. My class and mine around me are on the second floor now. And you've got 135 or 40 years of sober-looking young men, masculine haircuts, nice dark coats, and then my generation, about 5 years stretch, has these awful Beatleish haircuts and these terrible-looking horse blanket sport coats. I'm really ashamed to even look at that. But this is the class from 1893, and significant is that the man to the far left is John Meyer, who ended up teaching at the seminary for 44 years until he was 90. In fact, he preached 12 days before his death at the age of 90. And then down at the bottom, second to the left, is John Brenner, who became the Synod president in the 1930s. He was at St. John's on 8th Street for 50 years. He was the pastor who shepherded the Synod through a lot of the turmoil with the Missouri Synod before he retired from Synod presidency at 79. I remember feeling quite old when I turned 59. Then I realized that President Brenner just became the Synod president then and lasted for 20 years. So that was a class that had some notable people in it. There are old pictures of these men getting together for conferences. Sometimes they were Missouri and Wisconsin people together. They were often deeply intermarried with each other, so you never quite know who to talk about because they were probably connected somehow. Here's Old Main, which was built actually in New Ulm, I think, at the time Dr. Martin Luther College started, so it was part of the era when it was still a pastor training school. Here you see an early picture of the first basketball team at New Ulm, and this is a picture at our seminary now that shows three guys who were out tobogganing in 1943. The first one is a Berg, the second one is a Stern, and the third one is a Schumann. So, and a couple of the families have married into the Scharf family, which means that about a fourth or a fifth of the clergy of the Synod are all interrelated somehow. This is one thing that's still quite different between Missouri and Wisconsin even today. If I look at the list of graduates, 3/4 of the names are immediately recognizable to me because I knew their father or grandfather. It's something like 2% at St. Louis. Children and grandchildren of the pastors are not going to the ministry. And many other people are going to the ministry, some of whom weren't Lutheran until they came to the seminary. It's a different environment. In 1925, August Pieper said this to explain the differences of the synods. He said, unlike Missouri, Wisconsin was not of one mold. It was not born of one united, strong, clear Lutheran spirit. In its beginnings, it was a conglomeration of people of various confessional leanings. They were to a large extent of people who were not thoroughly instructed in doctrine, who were consequently unclear in doctrinal issues. In addition, they were in part strangers to each other. They did not come from the same place in Europe. As a synod, they did not really know what they were, what they wanted to be, or how to be about something useful. Even to this day, he wrote this in 1923, we are not yet of one unified active synodical mold. And people would talk by comparison about the tremendous camaraderie of the Missouri Synod, because those founders that Walter was with came over on 4 boats together. And they were so sure of their role that they actually had an archivist along on the boat who kept records of them from the beginning. And I think one of the things that's always been different about the personalities of the 2 synods, which still exists today to some extent, is that Missouri had a kind of like I say, a camaraderie, some people would say an esprit de corps, a sense of themselves. And Wisconsin had this feeling of being kind of the little sister. And it shows itself sometimes in what people would write and say to each other. But there are many, many others in the time who talk about what a wonderful connection this was. This is I'm watching the clock and not doing real well, but this was a census in 1928 to show that there were over 1 million Missouri Synod Lutherans, United Lutheran Church, which became the LCA. But Wisconsin was about 6th in size with about 220,000 at the time. As you get into the 20th century, Lutherans became the 3rd and then the 2nd largest Protestant denomination in the country, always after Baptists, sometimes after Methodists, never came close to Catholics. And this is a hopelessly confused chart, which most of us had to memorize at one point going through school. All the different synods moving around. And what was significant about both the synods is that way they would not have fellowship unless there was complete unity in teaching. And this is how one Missouri Synod professor explained it. Those who say A and join the Ohioans and Iowans together in prayer and worship must also say B and institute joint preaching Lord's Supper. Anyone who offers joint prayer with the Ohioans has granted them the deepest and most intimate fellowship a Christian can give. He cannot deny them any other form of brotherly harmony. There is no closer communion on earth than when people come together in the name of Jesus. If we unite with the Ohioans in prayer, we must also invite them to our altars and bring them to our pulpits and recommend their churches to our pastors and lay people. The remarkable thing about this is that this is what a Missouri Synod professor said about their practice, what we today call the unit concept of fellowship. By the 1950s, the Missouri Synod was saying, well, we never really officially practiced that. And we said, well, yeah, you did. And we could point out to them from their documents. So a big issue as the synods came to crisis was who changed? Here's Heineke's statement where it's no more necessary for 2 church bodies to be one body than for 2 Christians to marry each other. But there were many people also said what a great memory this was of how we got along with each other. Ministers met in mixed conferences, socialized, preached at each other's festivals, accepted calls interchangeably. He could have had intermarried. As I remember, we got along well. The Missourians were cordial lovers of cigars and good humor. They looked and acted like good Christian men, as indeed they were. At 2 o'clock on every Sunday afternoon, the Lutheran Hour was broadcast on countless radio stations across the country. In its palmy days, the program was called Bringing Christ to the Nations, and nobody laughed. In those days, the Missouri Synod stood for something, and thanks to the Lutheran Hour, everybody knew what that was. When you read some of these things from the 1930s and 40s, you can't imagine how nasty it would get by the 1950s. Imagine having a conference meeting together with 3 other bodies and having 2 separate opening worship services because you couldn't agree with each other and wouldn't take communion together. It got to that point. But for many, well, they're all in heaven now, but for people who have those memories, they believe it just couldn't happen. It couldn't happen there. So I took all of your time, I'm sorry. Does anybody want to leap on either of these questions? Is there anybody that still has family members who would talk about the good old days? Or maybe the not so good old days? And can you see how that history, early history, shaped what we've become? Yes?
Yeah, okay. I went to New Ulm High School and college, okay? And I was a class of 1961.
Oh,
High school, okay?
I should talk to you.
And in the dorms, see, I left home when I was 14. My mom sent me there the last 2 years of high school and 4 years of college at New Ulm, teacher training. Anyhow, okay, so in the dorms and on the campus, you got to know everybody, and it was Missouri and Wisconsin sitting together in this and that. Okay, a lot of friends and this and that. Okay, well then, went in, when we got back to school in, right after 1961, we graduated in 61 in June, then we got back to school, and then we got to the religion classroom, and then the professor said, I have an announcement for you, and I felt a little ominous, you know what I mean? I knew something was up, we didn't know what was going on. And he said the two synods had split, and therefore, some of you people on campus here won't be with us anymore.
Yeah,
And that was true.
yeah.
And then, not only, but, all right, it split my class, is what it did. And anyhow, then, and fellowships and this type of thing. But we didn't know what was going on. We never heard of it. But I will just throw in this, that some of the Missouri people stayed with the Wisconsin Synod, switched to the Wisconsin Synod, so there we are.
There was some switching both ways. And some in Wisconsin were kind of nasty about this and said, you know, I know a Missouri pastor who agrees with us, but they have such a better pension program than we do, they're not going to make the move. Maybe that was actually true in some cases, I don't know. I did a little survey in the fall, and I was writing to people who got out of school around your time. Well, you know, not to give anything away, but a lot of them are pretty old and couldn't really participate. Some had,
Well, we feel like 17, so there we are.
some of them had remarkable memories. And I had a classmate at seminary who grew up in a family that just loved Concordia in Milwaukee. And even though they were Wisconsin, their family went there for high school. He started there in 1960. He made friends there. During the summer, he was told by his family, we have now been told that Concordia is the worst place you can go. And he was confused about this, finished at Area Lutheran High School, came back and became Wells and was in my class at seminary, became a Wells pastor, ended up in the ELCA, mostly working in administrative offices. I had lunch with him this summer, and this is raw for him, like it happened yesterday. There were other people who said, you know, and I'd be one of them, I was in a big Wells church, I never paid any attention. Life went on for us like it didn't happen. So there are these differences, and sometimes you almost ended up in a place by accident. I mean, churches would, if a Wisconsin pastor wasn't available, they'd call a Missouri guy. It happened in my uncle's church. And it was almost like playing musical chairs and the music stopped. And then you found yourself in one church body or the other when you weren't necessarily, you know, brought up that way or had that mind. But all in all, I would say it's hard to imagine. It would be hard to imagine how anybody in 1865 would have believed that Missouri and Wisconsin could be as close in harmony and as much working together as they were for almost 90 years. And then you had people growing up generations there who would never have imagined it could change. And so the start of the change comes next week. We talk about some of the initial issues that made us wonder something's happening here, but I don't know exactly what it is. So we'll come to that next week. The book is available. You can buy it at NPH. I won't hawk it too much, but except by saying I think I get $1.12 if you buy one. Unfortunately, we used to all be able to go to the publishing house and buy it, not pay and look at it for ourselves and not pay shipping, but those days are over. But they're pretty quick, and certainly would invite you to get a copy, or at least take a copy to the library if you're interested. Thank you for being patient. Let's close with the blessing. The grace of our Lord Jesus Christ and the love of God and the fellowship of the Holy Spirit be with us all. Amen.